Welcome, everyone, to God's Views on Political News. So glad that you're back with us again today. Please feel free to comment during the show, ask any questions that you'd like to ask us. And we have a lot to discuss today, so we're going to go ahead and just jump right in there. So, Bill, we're still talking about the Florida school shooting at Stoneman Douglas, a high school. I think there's so much since our last show when we were talking about it that we need to continue to talk about it. I mean, it seems like now we're more talking about Sheriff Israel and his deputies than anything else. I mean, it seems to be taking up a lot of the news right now.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that Sheriff Israel, in trying to bash others, ends up getting bashed.
I know. Well, he and let's talk about that a little bit. He did bash one of his deputies, Scott Peterson. And basically what happened was, and I think probably most people know, but in case they don't, Scott Peterson, when he showed up at the school, supposedly waited outside, and you could see it in the video. Marlene made it on time. We're glad you're here, Marlene. You can see it on the video that he's crouching outside, taking a position, and doesn't go in. The sheriff, Scott Israel, had come out, and a few days ago, I guess it's been now. Things are happening so quickly, I don't know the time anymore. But he came out and said that, I'm so disappointed. He's too afraid to go in. He stood outside. Peterson didn't go in. I'm basically almost coming to the point of saying I'm ashamed of the guy because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. And he's later come out. This is the sheriff has come out and said, I gave him I gave him all the tools, told him what to do. And if he didn't go in, that's not my responsibility. So it's come out now that there were maybe 3 other deputies that didn't go in. And now Scott Peterson has an attorney.
Well, from what I've learned so far, number one, this Peterson guy took a position that he said was according to his training or something like that, thinking that the shooter was outside. I don't know. We'll probably need to kind of hear more as the story comes out. But going back to the sheriff's comments, where this Scott Peterson guy is concerned, basically he's saying that I can't take responsibility for what another person decides to do. And yet the sheriff will go and lambaste Dana Lish and the NRA, that they're responsible for all these things. Some of these kids that they're parading out on television are saying, well, it's the governor's fault. It's this person's fault. It's everyone's fault except the guy who had the gun, according to these people. So it's just, I wanted to scream when I hear the sheriff say, basically, I'm not taking responsibility for this guy. I did everything I knew to do, and he's responsible for his own actions. So hypocritical. Drives me crazy.
I know. And one of the things that you were talking about with Scott Peterson, let me just kind of get back to that. He did, when he hired the attorney, what he's saying now, and he said this through his attorney, that basically he thought that the gunfire was coming from outside of the school. And so when he got there, he thought he was securing everything because he thought it was on the outside. And then who knows what happens with the other deputies, why they were there or anything else. But what we do know is somewhere in the mix of things, the Coral Springs police officers went in and they actually started saving people. Right. Now, one of the things that I wanted to bring up, because you had mentioned this too, is that, I at one point went through the police academy, and we were trained in the police academy that if there was a SWAT operation going on, or that if you, let's say, for example, that you were getting there and, there was a bank robbery, for example, and you came upon the scene as a police officer, you were to call SWAT, and you were supposed to wait for SWAT to get there. So don't go in, wait for SWAT to arrive. However, supposedly now, after Columbine, which was April 20th, 1999, police are now supposed to go in an active shooting situation. They're not supposed to wait outside. They're supposed to go in and try to save as many lives as they can and not wait for SWAT. So it's kind of like, whose story do you believe now? Did Scott Peterson, was he telling the truth in the very beginning? And this sheriff was trying to make it something else. So the sheriff didn't believe him. But I agree with you. The sheriff goes to the town hall meeting with Dana Lash, who, as everybody knows, is a supporter of the NRA. She's a spokesperson for the NRA. And all he could do was talk about her and guns and all that. And as you said, he didn't want to take any responsibility for anything that happened. But it was all her fault for being in the NRA, and it was all the NRA's fault for, talking about guns.
Well, I don't know. I really don't know anything about this man before all this came up. Other than, he's in Southeast Florida, down in, close to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, all that kind of stuff. And more liberal in that section of the state.
A little bit more liberal. Just
blue. So obviously he has some liberal ways of thinking about things. And number one, I don't take responsibility for anything. It's not my fault. Someone else is at fault here. Now, here's what I'm waiting to hear. These other deputies for the Broward County Sheriff's Department, if it's true they didn't go in, why? Were they under orders not to go in? That's what I want to find out, for a fact, not just hearsay, but I want to know for a fact, were they told don't go in, stand down, what have you? Because it seems to me if a school building where children are, where there's someone who has a gun, it's almost like a burning building. And there's a mom in there screaming, "Save my baby." I'd like to think that I would go and, do what's necessary. And if I've got a gun and there are kids being shot at, I'd like to think that I would take some kind of an action. I may not be able to save anybody, but you'll never know if you're sitting outside while the gun's on the inside. I mean, that's just the way I see it.
Yeah, as Marlene said, she also brought up the point that they also held back the paramedics, supposedly. Some of the EMS people were saying we weren't allowed to go in. We asked to go in, and they wouldn't allow us to go in. Now, that could be because, the active shooter situation, and they just said, we don't want you to go in, and that would be what is typically said. But the EMS paramedics are trying to make the point that typically they're supposed to go in with the police officers in any type of shooting like that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll be hearing more information coming out, and when it does, we'll have a clearer picture of what happened. In the meantime, it seems to me that it's shameful that 17 people are dead, and very little's been said about any of these, individual people compared to these 2, 3, 4 kids that they've been parading out on television to attack. The governor of Florida, to attack Dana Lash, however you say your last name.
Lash, like eyelash. Yeah.
Like an eyelash? Okay, yeah. All right. And the NRA and others, they've spent more time on that than they have about speaking to the fact that there's 17 people dead. There's 17 families that are mourning.
Yeah. And you look at that, and the coach and the other teacher, I mean, those two, they did what they were supposed to do. They went and tried to save lives of the students. They didn't think about the fact that they were unarmed. They just went and as the Bible says, lay their lives down for others,
Well, the student who was junior ROTC, who died, wanted to go to West Point and posthumously and an honorary situation, this is what I understood anyway. They kind of accepted him into West Point, because, he was trying to protect people. Right. Why aren't we hearing that day after day after day? I don't know. Well,
it doesn't fit the agenda. They're pushing the AR-15 ban and the ban now that the Democrats want to ban all semi-automatic weapons. So it doesn't fit that agenda.
Well, I don't know if you're wanting to get into this now, but since you brought it up, I want to ask some of these people, what laws would you like to see passed? What exactly is the law that you think is going to eliminate this? Because I think what's really going on here is they know good and well that there are laws that would, there are no laws that would stop somebody crazy enough to want to do this. I mean, obviously they're attacking the Second Amendment piecemeal. They're coming at it, trying to chip away at it, because if you can do away with the Second Amendment, then who's to say you can't do away with the First? So I really think that's what they're after, personally. And they're using some of these other people, these young people, in my view anyway, as pawns.
Yeah. And I want to say about the Second Amendment, I used to think, how could these people really believe what they're saying? And these people, I mean, the liberal left, how could they really believe that if we take away the guns from law-abiding citizens, that somehow the criminals are going to have an epiphany and go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that guns were so bad. I'm going to lay my guns down now, and I'm not going to hurt anybody. As we all know, it's the schools that the gun-free zones is where these people go. That's where they go to shoot up the schools. That's where they go in Florida to kill people. That's what they do. And I used to believe that the left really didn't believe that. They were just saying that. But no, Bill, they really believe that. They really honestly believe that if we get rid of the Second Amendment and get rid of guns, everything's going to be okay. I can't explain it, but it's that's the way it is.
Well, we talked about this last week, so it seems appropriate to address it here now, and that is, if you're looking to resolve this situation politically, legally, it's not going to happen, because you're never going to be able to eradicate the condition of someone's heart through legislation, through PSAs and all these kinds of things. It is a spiritual issue. That's why we're in this mess. I said it last week. When you ask God to leave the schools 50 years ago, he left. He accommodated us. And because he left, all this other stuff has moved in. I would even go so far to say in that regard, Susan, that although I'm not against arming teachers that want to be armed, although I'm not against posting guards at the doors of these schools, that's in effect putting a Band-Aid on the real situation. It might eliminate some of the threats. It might stop some of the shooting in the sense that these people are coming out, to invade the school and shoot them up. It might eliminate a lot of that. It might eliminate all of it, but it doesn't address the problem. It doesn't really address the issue, because you still got all this other stuff going on inside the school. and the fact that God has been dismissed, asked not to leave, you can put all the guards you want up that, you might keep a shooter here and there out, but you're not going to keep the problem out.
Yeah, it's putting a Band-Aid on the problem of godlessness that's going on in our schools. Now, as Jeffrey said, the gun-free zones at the schools, those are just like a turkey shoot is what it is. And that's exactly what it is. And I want to talk a little bit about the Second Amendment since we went there. It concerns me because we have, as I said, the Democrats are coming out now and they want to ban all semi-automatic rifles. They want all assault rifles. They want them gone. That came out like today, I believe, or yesterday. And it's a new bill that they're trying to push. And it's something that Dianne Feinstein pushed years ago to get rid of the AR-15s and just get them out of the way. Used to be, you would always look to the Supreme Court and think the Supreme Court is going to uphold my Second Amendment rights. It's my constitutional right to arm myself. Well, recently there's a case that's going through. It's a California case, and Bill, we always talk about, or at least I do, whatever happens in California is important, and you should listen because it's going to happen to you on down the line here. And this is exactly, I think, making my point here. There's a case that in California, there's a 10-day waiting period before you can legally take your gun home. So you can buy your gun, but it's going to sit there for 10 days. It's a cooling off period from what I don't know. But they're going to run your background check and everything else. And for 10 days, you don't get your gun. There's a case in San Diego where these two people brought a lawsuit saying the 10 days is an infringement upon my Second Amendment rights. It's way too long. And so the district court agreed with them. The appellate court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, of course, disagreed with them and said, no, that's perfectly fine. And so then they went to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, to try to get them to rule on it. And the United States Supreme Court said, nah, we're not going to hear the case. And Justice Thomas has said, there hasn't been a case heard for the Second Amendment in the Supreme Court for 8 years.
Interesting.
8 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that he had some other comments to make there, but I had a question for you where this California law is concerned. You can go buy a gun. You have to wait 10 days. I think I understood that the idea they had is that maybe in that 10 days you'll decide, you know what, I don't need the gun after all.
Yeah.
Right? Something like that. Maybe you'll come to your senses.
Right.
I'm just curious. How many days do you have to wait if you decide you want to get an abortion in California?
Yeah. No waiting. Just come right on in. Yeah. Yeah.
No cooling off period.
No
rethinking this and thinking maybe I might regret this later on.
Nope.
Well,
no.
Okay.
You can just come on in. And in fact, people can't try to talk you out of it, Bill. You can't have the birthing centers that try to tell you maybe you shouldn't have an abortion. In fact, they right now, unless the law has changed in the last couple of days, right now the birthing centers have to tell you where you can go get an abortion, even if you want to save your baby.
Well, we'll see how this develops. But I'll just say personally, I'm not going to be lectured by anyone on why guns are so dangerous and how they're killing our children when you're in favor of going into a mother's womb and slaughtering an unborn child. I'm not going to be lectured by an individual that takes that position. Now back to the unwillingness of the Supreme Court to listen to this case. You had written an article about this, and we were talking about how important we felt this was. Clarence Thomas basically said, in addition to what you just brought out, that he feels that this particular court right now looks at the Second Amendment as a, and I think I'm quoting him correctly here, a constitutional orphan, meaning that they don't really consider it as important as the other nine other Bill of Rights that are in the Constitution. Yeah. Basically, opening the door for people like state legislature in California and Alyssa Milano and others to chip away at the Second Amendment. But when you start chipping away at one, it's going to undermine the rest of them as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's like he made the point also, and kind of like what you've talked about. He said that, if this were a case that somebody was waiting for a 10-day waiting period for abortion, I'm sure the Supreme Court would hear this case because it's a First Amendment right. It's about abortion. You're going to hear this. You're going to say, oh, no, we can't do that. But, and he was trying to make the point, why are you not upholding, the Second Amendment is another constitutional right that's equal to the First Amendment or any other amendments. Why aren't you taking this case? And that's the thing. When you have this going on, just like you said, it's really scary to see what could be done if we know that the Supreme Court is saying, we're not even going to undertake to hear a case with the Second Amendment. How much can they, in fact, chip away when the Supreme Court doesn't want to, walk into it and have anything to say about it?
Well, and then you have to consider too, it's not just the liberal Democrats who are taking this position. I just read the other day how Condoleezza Rice has said we need to take another look at the Second Amendment. We need to. I don't see why some civilian has to be armed with a military-style rifle, which is an inaccurate statement, first of all.
Right. The AR-15 isn't a military-type rifle.
No, it's not. In fact, I'm sure you're aware of this. Maybe people listening are aware of this, but the whole AR thing, the liberals try to make that says or stands for assault rifle. No, it doesn't. It stands for Armalite. It's the people who, developed that particular weapon and the style. And as I understand it anyway, the military kind of borrowed from them. So AR is just the short version of Armalite. So it has nothing to do with an assault rifle. And by the way, and I saw this the other day and I just thought it was pretty shrewd of this guy. He says any rifle that you use to assault someone is an assault rifle. He said, if I take a golf club and I assault you, it becomes an assault club. Yeah. So it's craziness.
It is crazy. Now Dawn made a good point. She said, without the Second Amendment, you have no rights. And our man is a citizen. Without arms, you are a subject.
That's a
And it's
very good point. It's a
and
very good point.
and also, that people make the point like, well, why do you need an AR-15? Because as Condoleezza Rice was saying, why we don't really need that gun anymore. Okay, the whole idea about the Second Amendment is to be able to defend yourself against a government, a tyrannical government, right? So if
Right.
you have a handgun and somebody else has an AR-15 on the other side, you might as well have a stick when the other person has a handgun. I mean, it's not going to help you all that much. And so I do see an argument for saying we do need AR-15s. And if I want to use it for hunting or self-defense or anything that I want, I should be allowed to do that. And Jeffrey says, when does common sense kick in again and the value of life at any age is restored? The smokescreen of focus on gun control deflects away from liberals and some conservatives on the value of life. And Alan says, because the government has them, that's why you need them.
Well, the reason I have them is because people say I don't need them.
Uh-huh.
That's why I went out and bought them.
Yeah.
I won't say how many, but the reason I have them is because somebody out there on CNN and MSNBC says I shouldn't have them. So that's why I have them. I'm just that way sometimes. But, if we either live in a free country or we don't.
Yeah.
And right now it seems to me, and it has been this way for a long time now, people are wanting to rule by emotion. Not by reason, not by logic, not by what's right and what's wrong, but by emotion. And in the emotion of the moment, we want to make some decisions. I don't think I've ever made a decision when I was mad and hot-headed that I look back on it and said, that's about the wisest decision I've ever made. So we make these reactions to an emotional situation, and we end up paying for it down the road.
Well, I think that, one thing that we're seeing also is that the left has basically upped its game a little bit. And by that, what I'm saying is they have found the moment in time where they can say, we're going to use children, put them out there to spread our agenda. And they're doing it pretty successfully so far.
Yeah, because no one would dare attack these children who've been through such a tragedy. Well, I have thought on that too. And that is if this 16, 17, however old they are, number one, they survived a tragedy. They should have never had to go through that. Okay, they survived a tragedy, and for that they have my sympathy.
Right.
But if you are going to now lock arms with those who want to infringe upon my rights, and in my mind, in my way of thinking, indirectly assault my wife and children, then you no longer have my sympathy. You are my adversary. We are antagonists now, because if you're going to align yourself that way and berate and make baseless accusation against people out of emotion, and frankly, I find it very hard to believe that some of these kids are. I better be careful how I say this. I just feel like people are feeding them the information to argue, personally.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because I was saying this yesterday on a show that these kids, there's a lot of people like to jump onto kids that are like sensationalists. That there was a guy, a political guy. He was a young boy. I mean, I don't even know how old he was, 12. I don't even think he was a teenager yet. And during the 2016 election, he was coming out, Donald Trump, conservative. That's all he could talk. And people were like, oh, wow, this kid is so smart. He's so intelligent. I got to get him on my show. I got to get him on here. And he was paraded out in front of everybody. Well, all of a sudden, when it looked like it was going to go south for Donald Trump, what did he do? He flipped, went on the Bernie Sanders trail. So all of a sudden he became, I'm endorsing Bernie Sanders. What he's saying is great, blah, blah, blah. And people were like, wait a minute, I thought you were a conservative. Well, yeah, he's a child. Children change their minds rather quickly. And in fact, now he's back in the conservative row again, and people are kind of flocking to him again. It's like they didn't learn the first time. Like, why are you allowing a child who is inexperienced in life and not, doesn't have the age on them that you do? tell you what you should do. And that's the same thing with these kids. I agree with you, Bill, 100%. I think there are activists behind them, their parents, perhaps, other people who are supplying money to their cause. And we know there are George Clooney, Oprah Winfrey, and somebody else, liberal, is doing the same thing. So, in supplying them money. Why wouldn't we think that these kids are being coached to say what they say? And this one kid, David Hogg in particular, he's out in front of the camera every 5 minutes. He's on CNN. Newsweek said he's an aspiring broadcaster. The kid has the ear and the eyes, of everybody across America, and he's playing it out. And again, I have sympathy for him for what he went through. I don't have sympathy now for what he's doing. Right. I do think he has a voice that should be heard, allowed to sit in a listen session like Donald Trump did and listen to him. But I'm not going to take the opinion of a child and have it control what I do in my life.
Right. Well, have you ever seen the commercial? I forget. I think it's an insurance commercial or something. And this young driver, he's had an accident or he's got a flat tire or something like that. And his dad, he's on the phone with his dad asking him, his dad's asking him, do you have a lug wrench? And he's like, yeah, of course, Dad, I have a lug wrench. And he looks at his friend, he's like, what's a lug wrench? Or
is this a lug wrench?
Right. Right. All right. I realize that's parody, but at the same time, there's always a little bit of truth in jest. We have a generation up and coming that if it's not on their iPhone or on their computer screen, they don't know what to do. Yeah. They can't make change without a calculator. Yep. I know that from experience. All right. So they're kids, they're growing up, they got to mature, all those kinds of things. They have to have life experiences. We were all there, understand it, get it.
Exactly.
Which is exactly why I'm not going to take their advice and how to make policy. Just because you, unfortunately, had to endure a very tragic situation. I can't imagine how frightened they must have been. And for that, they have my sympathy. But that doesn't qualify you or anyone else, adult that's gone through a tragedy like that, doesn't necessarily qualify you to speak to policy that has for over 200 and almost 250 years now has sustained this nation, or at least it's played a role in sustaining this nation. So anyway, I realize that people out there, they have young people, they feel, well, my young person's the exception to the rule. I've got kids and I love my kids, but there's certain things I'm not going to let my kids decide for me.
Bill, I'm sure I'm not alone in saying this. When I was 17, I thought I knew everything, and there was an adult that really could tell me anything. And then when I got older, I realized, my God, how dumb some of the things that I was saying. It didn't mean that what I was saying didn't have merit, that it didn't have, people should listen to. But again, with an adult to look at that and go, oh yes, we should do that. Susan at 17 knows everything. Let's follow her. And this kid, David Hogg, basically now he's stepping up his game too. He's going out and telling people, hey, everybody in America, when it's spring break, don't come to Florida. I mean, it's like, okay, what is, until there's gun law changes. This isn't solving the problem. This isn't going back and doing anything that's going to really help the problem. This is just getting your 15 minutes of fame.
Well, I was about to say he's having his 15 minutes of fame. He's going to exploit it and say things that he thinks people want to hear. By the way, two points I wanted to make. I think it was Mark Twain that said something like, when I was 15, I thought my old man was the dumbest guy I'd ever seen. Exactly. And by the time I turned 21, I was amazed at how much he had learned in just 6 years.
Yeah.
I have really kept that, always kept that in mind. I saw that growing up, but as far as the don't come to Florida for spring break, I lived in Florida for 10 years. I know a lot of people live in Florida, and guess what? They're thinking, yes, please don't come to spring break in Florida. Stay home.
I know.
Go to Mexico.
Well, and you can see also the mainstream media is really hyping these kids up and pushing them, right in the forefront. The other person, a female. Her name is Emma Gonzalez. She's the one that has the shaved head that came out and talked.
Yeah.
They're saying, oh, she's got more followers now on Twitter than the NRA, and Twitter and Google are even starting, and YouTube are starting to take down comments, take down videos, anything that has to do, if anybody says anything about David Hogg, they take it down, and part of it I can understand, you're protecting children. I get it. But they're doing more than protecting children. These people are, meaning Twitter and YouTube and Google. They're going out, they're verifying their accounts. They're making them stars is what they're doing. They're putting them up on a pedestal, and they're saying, watch these people. They're the leaders. And we've even have government officials who said, Lawrence Tribe, he's a big scholar in Harvard law professor and all that. Everybody talks about him in law school. He's saying, oh, they're very smart. They really know what they're talking about. They're the victims, so we should listen to them and follow them. And it's ridiculous. And I really like the fact that the lieutenant governor in Georgia, some of these companies are now saying, based upon what the kids are saying, we're going to boycott the NRA. We're just going to, everything that we had when gave towards them, or if they were advertising with us, it's over. Or the banks are saying, we're not going to allow you to open up an account really and bring your money through here for the guns that you have. And the lieutenant governor of Georgia said to Delta, who was boycotting the NRA, hey, look, if you don't reverse your decision, I'm going to do everything that I can possibly do to end any tax cuts for you. We're done. And I love that. I love the fact that somebody in Georgia would stand up for, all of us on our Second Amendment rights and have them not, bully the NRA. What did the NRA do? They did not pull the trigger. Yeah.
Well, and if that holds up, that's going to cost Delta about $40 million in tax breaks. And so I'm like, oh, well, So, look, where these kids are concerned is it's already been established here. They're kids.
They're kids.
They went through a very hard and difficult situation. But, I'm sorry. Go get a job, get a house payment, have some kids, grow some gray hair, then I'll listen to you.
Yeah.
Then I will take what you say into consideration as I adjust how I see the world,
Yeah.
But right now, you don't know anything. You know your 16, 17 years experience. And I would say that to my kids. I have said that to my kids, and trying to raise them. Look, you see this way, but I'm looking at it from a perspective you don't have yet. I'll listen to what you have to say, but here is what I have to say. You're going to listen to what I have to say. And when all is said and done, we're going to make decisions based on what I think is in all of our best interests, including you. So it's frightening, to say the least, to hear and to see people who are supposed to be leading this country suggesting that we should listen to these inexperienced young people when it comes to policy, as if to say the founding fathers, who, in my view, most of them were geniuses.
I know.
As if they didn't know what they were talking about.
Well, and also I know that everything that you've said, I just want to make it clear, and I know people that are listening understand it, but just in case there's anybody out there who misunderstands, you're not taking away from what happened to them, and you're not taking away from what they learned because of what they went through. They had to grow up rather quickly, and you do grow up rather quickly when something like that happens to you, and you're not diminishing that at all, and neither am I. But clearly, we have to stop treating children as though they are adults, and in particular, what the left does when they use children to further their political agenda. That needs to stop. Yeah,
well, they probably won't, because they found a magic formula here.
Yes.
And they're gonna use it to the nth degree. And so no, we're not taking away from anything these kids have experienced. As far as that goes, what about the kids that were in that church out in Texas? What about the kids that were in the crowd in Las Vegas that had to flee for their life?
Exactly.
What about all these other situations? anyone who's had to go through tragedy, many years ago, it was a different set of circumstances, and I wasn't even there, but people I knew that went through a very horrific tragedy, and someone that was very close to me died as a result of that. And I remember just why did this have to happen? And you're looking for answers, and you're thinking, well, if this had happened, if that hadn't have happened, it's always going to be that way. But I mean, and in life, and just because you've gone through a tragedy doesn't make you an expert on everything. It's
right.
not, it doesn't equate to staying at a Holiday Inn Express. It doesn't make you an overnight mastermind at policy. So we're not taking anything away from what they went through, and they should be allowed to talk about that. I'm not sure if CNN and MSNBC day after day after day is the right platform for that. But yeah, they need to be able to talk about that and get some things out of their system. But it doesn't mean that I have to surrender my convictions just because they went through a tragedy.
And it is sad because it's, as you said before, people, they know that they're apt not to say anything against a child. It's like, oh, you don't like children? Is that why you're saying that against a child? And it does, it silences you and your First Amendment rights, and Twitter and Google and YouTube are helping to do that in this case. And it helps as they chip away with your Second Amendment rights, because there are kids saying, we're calling on AR-15s. First of all, when it started, it was like, oh, we're not trying to take away your Second Amendment rights. This is what the kids were saying. We're just wanting to open a dialogue, and we don't need guns like the AR-15, that type thing. And it became so politicized. I mean, I don't know how anybody could look at it and not say that it's something that is politicized. And what I also found interesting too, Bill, was the fact that, there's another person in Florida who's trying to tell people what to do. He's not a child. This is a billionaire that's in Florida. I think his name is Mike Fernandez or something like that. I don't run in his circles, so I don't know. But he's he's telling politicians that they're not getting any more money unless they go in there and they make major changes to the gun policy. And he wants them to get rid of the military type weapons. So automatically, I'm assuming he's on the left. And also, he's saying we want age limits in order to purchase weapons. We want to reduce the amount of ammunition you can get. And we want to reduce the magazine capacity. To me, in my mind, this makes a very good argument of why we should not have lobbyists, why we should not have people in politics who are there just to get the lobbyists' money and to have a career in politics. It's even more so why we need the common everyday man or woman to be in politics, who is what the forefathers did. They had this sometimes was a second job, for them, or they would go in and have a certain period of time. They didn't get paid for it or whatever. We need to go back doing that. Here you have a guy with a big money who's telling politicians now, and it's all people have said it sounds like blackmail. It isn't, but it is the legal way. It isn't. I mean, that he's not telling a politician you must do this. Here's some money, I'm paying you, but it's almost it's blackmail to the American public, I think.
Well, it's buying policy.
Yes,
it's if you got enough money, we'll buy policy and we'll craft the nation the way we want it to be. Isn't this what the left has been screaming about with tax reform? Isn't this what they've been screaming about with Donald Trump in there, that, the big business and the big corporations are going to be the one in charge and it's going to be the little guy down here? And here is someone who's actually saying, I'm not going to give you any money until you do what I say to do. Boy, I really wish there was a politician who would say, you know what you can do with your money? And then I'll just stop right there, because this is supposed to be looking at things from God's point of view. But looking at it from God's point of view, that's where the adversary works. When you get into these kinds of situations, this is where the adversary does his best work. And that's a scale that's not balanced. And God said that's an abomination to him. So, and that's what this amounts to. And so I hope that there are people who will do the right thing, regardless of whether this guy gives another dime to their campaigns. I hope that there are people in the right place that will do the right thing. I think, you know what, I wouldn't say I'm a big Marco Rubio fan, but I do think the little bit I saw of his part of the town hall, he was trying to be, apply some common sense to the situation. If you start doing this, then this is going to happen. I didn't see all of it because I didn't want to throw a brick through my television. But anyway, that's another story.
No, same way. I felt the same way. I couldn't watch it.
Yeah,
it was just an opportunity to come out there and to get bash anybody who was an NRA supporter, bash anybody who was a Republican, and that's all it was. It was a bashing session.
Well, I think, and I know you know this, I know a lot of people realize this, the Second Amendment is under an immense attack. It's a full court press, and they're pulling out all stops to try to make some inroads. So here's what I'm going to say. I have weapons. I believe in the Second Amendment. In my house, a weapon is within reach within 4 or 5 feet, Of course, I only live in a 500 square foot cabin, so that's not saying a whole lot. But we believe in protecting ourselves. But it's one of those things, we have them and pray we will never, ever, ever have to use them in self-defense. That being said, our greatest defense as the people of God, as believers, is not an AR. It's not a 357. It's not a 12 gauge. It's a relationship with the creator of all things. Psalm 33 says that the angel of the Lord encamps round about them that fear him, and he delivers them. And so we have the promise of angelic protection when we fear him. That doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. I'm not saying that. It just means that we have a promise that if we have a relationship to the degree that we fear him, that he's the one that we hold in awe and respect, and we have a godly fear for him, he says that he will watch out for us. He's the guardian of Israel. So back to something I said earlier, the reason these things happen in schools, the reason these things happen in post offices and workplaces and different things like that, and sometimes good people are touched by it, but the overall reason these things are happening is because we don't have a fear of God. We don't have a fear of anything, really, as a culture, as a nation. The young people coming up don't have any respect for law enforcement. They don't have respect for our governmental leaders. Now, you can make the argument that people do things to undermine that respect. Okay. But the point is that for years now, kids have gone around with T-shirts that used to say no fear. And they didn't fear anything. They don't respect anything. And I'm not blaming them necessarily. It's my generation, it's your generation. We're the ones that kind of propagate this idea and this concept. But because there is no fear of God, there is no protection. That's why these things are happening.
And I think for some of them, it's not only no fear of God, it is no knowledge or understanding of God. No, a lot of kids haven't even been introduced to God. They don't even know that there is a God, I think, for some of them. And I've talked to some who are that way.
And whose fault is that?
Parents.
It's parents, it's us, it's this generation. And, like I said, 50 years ago more, God was asked, we don't want you, leave. And he did. He accommodated that request. And until we ask him to return, an AR is not going to save this nation. I mean, again, I say that as a staunch defender of the Second Amendment, but there's things at work here that are more powerful than my ability to load, to aim, and to fire a rifle. And that's why our ultimate defense is the Creator. He's the one we need to be looking to now. So anyway.
Absolutely. Well, and I wanted to say also, one of the things that I brought this up yesterday, and then I noted, and I wrote an article about it yesterday, and it came out this morning around 2:30 in the morning or something. And then I noticed that Breitbart actually had an article because people started to think about it. Okay. This is something that I think that was a contributing factor, let's just say, to some of these school shootings and maybe even to the one that happened in Florida just recently. I don't know if you remember this, Bill, but back in 2014, Obama and Eric Holder, his attorney general at the time, wanted to come up with some school guidelines because they felt that African American children and Hispanic children and special education children especially were being discriminated against. They were thinking that those students, if you looked at the statistics, that they would be most apt to be suspended or expelled in school. So they came up with these guidelines and basically said, only expel or suspend these children as a last resort. And part of what those guidelines, and I'm paraphrasing all of this, but part of what those guidelines talked about was if you have a law enforcement officer that's at the school, they're not to handle, to hand out any of the disciplinary actions. You're there, you're just going to talk to the kids, and say, how you doing, try to build a relationship type thing. And then the school is going to tell you what happens with the kids. So in other words, the school's going to keep the children. Number one, because if you have a child in the classroom, that's money to the schools. And they're not going to, according to the guidelines, they're not going to expel or suspend these children because it goes against the Obama era guidelines. Additionally, there was supposed to be a mental health programs that were offered. And we know in this case, we're looking at Broward County, which is a very liberal blue county. In my mind, I have no proof of it, but in my mind, of course, they were following the school guidelines. And if you go back and you talk to anybody that knew this 19-year-old that's being accused of shooting in Florida, I mean, the police had gone to had received 43 calls about this person. There's a list that I have of some of the students talking about this guy when he was in school, how he would talk about guns all the time, how he would talk about, they'd see pictures of him on Instagram, the phone calls, the tips that were made to the FBI, on and on and on. I mean, there's just so many of them. And it's in my article at SusanKnowles.com if anybody wants to see it. But my gosh, in my mind, they decided to keep this kid as long as they could because of these guidelines. And how many more schools are now following these guidelines and keeping kids that are putting other children at risk because of their behaviors?
Well, if that's true, that they were following these particular guidelines that were implemented by the Obama administration, here's what that says to me, or how it translates for me. Look at the far-reaching ramifications of a household with no father. Yeah. Because Obama, I have some serious issues with Barack Obama, and it has nothing to do with the color of his skin. I mean, a lot of people, if you say anything against Obama, well, you're a racist because he's black. And in reality, he's only half black. Right. He's half white too. And the problems that I have with Barack Obama, philosophically, ideologically, most of them don't stem from his black Muslim father, but from his white progressive mother. And the long-term ramifications of a household without a father, that's not taking anything away from mothers and those who are having to be single mothers. I know they have a hard job, but I think they'd be the first to admit that, gosh, it'd be a lot better if dad were here, and if dad were here and to balance this thing out, to guide this young man. And I see what you're describing as a direct result of that kind of an environment. I know that there are other things that, take a role in it and contribute to it, but I think that is a large part of why we have such problems today, is because fathers are absent. And even if they're there, some of them aren't there, if you understand what I mean. I haven't read a lot. I know that this young man that did the shooting, I heard that his father had died and then his mother died, and he was basically an orphan. It would just be interesting to me to see what kind of turn he took when his father was no longer there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, and not steer it away from the point you were making, but if this is accurate, if the Broward schools were following this policy, and this policy is instituted under the name of one who grew up in a fatherless home for all practical purposes, then you see how it has adverse affections on a multiplicity of people and for generations, perhaps, theoretically. And so that to me is how it translates. That one person can make such a huge difference in someone's life, either positively or negatively. And once that person is influenced, then they influence others. Consider this, and now let's juxtapose it against the death of Billy Graham. How one man, how he influenced so many people who then went out and influenced other people, who went out and influenced other people, and hopefully in a positive way. And he did that for generations. Yeah. It works both ways. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but when you're saying that, I'm thinking this is the result of some situation when one person can just put the right or the wrong thought in someone's head and how it just kind of propagates.
No, it's true. But once, I don't know, what I feel is such a shame in this, the outcome of this is that, back in February 2016, supposedly, I mean, these are all allegations, so I'm going to leave it that way. But a tipster was supposedly told the sheriff's office that they even said Nicholas Cruz planned to shoot up the school. And he'd only started attending there like a couple of weeks. He'd only been there a couple of weeks. And then, there was another one in February 5th, 2016, telling that he planned to shoot up the school. I mean, a tipster supposedly said those words. He's planning to shoot up the school 2 years before it happened.
Well, I don't work in the school system, so I may be speaking out of turn. But what I have observed is that the school systems, the school districts across this nation have tied the hands of teachers or administrators or what have you. They won't let them discipline or be any kind of someone who can direct these kids. And look, kids, the best of kids, don't always just listen to what you have to say and then turn on a dime to do the right thing. Sometimes it takes a little encouragement. When you and I were in school, they had these things called paddles. And I was on the receiving end of them a few times, let me tell you. And it got my attention. And I didn't turn out so bad. At least I don't think I did. But now you have to be their buddy. You have to be their friend. And so to say, oh, we're not going to expel them, that's the last possible option. Basically saying we're going to let them do whatever they want to do because they know we're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
That's just a formula for failure.
It's a formula for failure. And again, in the guidelines, it specifically says that the law enforcement officers are, to engage them and be friendly with them, but they're not going to have anything to do with the disciplinary actions with them. And I can see it now, that the school, there are other schools that may be following this policy that are keeping kids around, that are saying, perhaps that they're going to come shoot up the school or cutting themselves, and saying that, coming after other people, whatever. I mean, I do know that there are children that cut themselves in schools. I've treated those kids in schools. I do know that. And they're more of a danger to themselves, in doing that, not to other people. But I'm saying, when you have a combination of different behaviors that people are looking at, students, teachers, other people have looked at and said, there's something wrong here. It's almost an intentional tolerance of that behavior because there is a guideline that says you must ignore behavior that anybody with common sense and reason would find a danger to other people. I mean, and I'm not claiming that this school did that, but I'm saying if the schools are following that and they're doing that type of practice, this could absolutely be the case in many schools. How many more kids have to be put at risk before we do something?
Well, and hearing that, it makes me wonder how that may have influenced this particular school officer. What was his name? Scott Peterson. Mm-hmm. How that may have influenced his decision and what he did or didn't do. Can't help but wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think that the Secretary of Education immediately needs to look at and find out what the schools are actually following across the nation. And then it may be something that needs to be brought to President Trump's attention and absolutely just, take these guidelines and toss them out the window and start putting common sense. If we're not going to put God back in schools, we could at least have some type of common sense in school where we say that if you see a child that has all the warning signs in the world, 43 phone calls, 39 visits, I mean, on and on and on, CPS, everything. And the kid even came out supposedly to the tipster and said, I'm going to shoot up the school. I don't know what more you need to know that this kid probably shouldn't be in the school. And he probably should have been out long before he was. They sent him over to another school. And was he receiving the help? We know he may have been seeing a psychiatrist and getting medication. Was he seeing a therapist? Was anybody watching this kid? Doesn't sound like it, but I don't know for sure.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying about the common sense thing, but the way I see it, there isn't going to be any common sense if you're disconnected from God. You know, you're going to be double-minded in all your ways. You're going to be unstable. That's the answer, and it's free. It won't cost the taxpayer a dime. It'll cost us everything in terms of our will, our desires, our wants, but it won't cost the taxpayer a dime. And it's the best plan. It's the only plan that's going to work. I
know. And I hate to say this, but maybe you feel the same way. I don't see prayer being introduced back into the schools. I don't see, having God mentioned in schools by the teachers. If something like that happened, it would take an absolute miracle, which God can work miracles. I do think that if humans are left in charge of it, it's not going to happen. And if there's some slim chance it did, it would be maybe 100 years before you saw something like that happen.
I would be willing to wager that God was in that school that day.
Yeah.
17 people died. Several more were injured, which, by the way, I haven't heard a whole lot about that because they've been too busy parading these other kids out.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you God was in that school that day. He was with those individual students that were calling out to him and
absolutely,
that had a relationship with him. And I guarantee he was there. And he will be there. And we need to, as parents, and I know that people watching this do, but just to reaffirm, we need to pray over our children day and night. We need to pronounce blessings on them. And I am a person who, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that my mother's prayers saved me from certain death on more than one occasion. I could, relate all the facts to you. I won't bore you with that, but I know of at least 2 or 3 occasions when my mother's prayers saved my life. And so I know that works. And I can't explain why bad things happen to good people. We live in a fallen world. We have to deal with these things. But I guarantee you God was there.
Well, and I think I absolutely agree with you that he was there, and I also think that as the father who Mr. Pollock, who lost his daughter Meadow that day, I believe they're Jewish, and he was saying that this whole discussion that they're having right now in the schools and what's being on CNN and everything else should not be about the Second Amendment and gun control. What it should be about is the safety of our children and how we're going to go about doing that, because almost everybody you can find in the world is going to agree that children deserve to go to school and be safe, but they're not going to agree on gun control.
He's absolutely right. And hopefully he and others who are going through the same kind of grief and tragedy, with all due respect to these kids that they're putting on these programs, none of them have buried a child.
Yeah.
They have no comprehension of that.
I know.
And this man is speaking from that pain, and he deserves to be heard.
Yes. Absolutely. And I can't even almost imagine what he's going through. And, God bless the families and the people that have lost people, at that school shooting. And I hope that we can do a better job in the future. But we need to get real about our talk about, the safety of children and with Mr. Pollack, not make it about gun control, make it about, safety and exactly what we're going to do. We're out of time again, as we always are. The hour goes by so fast.
Let's talk about something cheerful next time.
I know. But I want to thank everybody for being here today. Please, if you will, share the show with everyone and just get the news out there and get the show out there to families and friends. Email them to people. Share them on Twitter. Share it on Twitter and on Facebook and everything else. I'm going to have it at my SusanKnowles.com a little later today. So if you can't share the Facebook one, you can share it on SusanKnowles.com. And it's also going to be on YouTube later today, unless they decide that they're going to take it down for whatever reason. So anyway, until next week, God bless you. We'll see you again next week. Take care.